The gavel was suspended in midair, ready to wipe a family's legacy off the map. Everyone expected the corporate giants to swallow the land whole. But when the poorest, quietest man in the county raised his battered paddle, the auctioneer laughed. Then the entire room went dead silent. The air inside the Oak Haven American Legion Hall tasted like stale coffee floor wax and desperate anxiety. It was the second Tuesday in November, a day that would later be etched into the local history of this struggling Midwestern farming community. The harsh fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long, tired shadows across the faces of men and women who had spent their entire lives fighting the dirt, the weather, and increasingly the banks. At the center of the room's quiet dread was the Henderson Tract, a pristine, highly coveted 450-acre parcel of land situated right at the bend of the Oak Haven River. For 4 generations, it had belonged to William Henderson, a stubborn traditional farmer who had refused to sell to corporate interests. But William had passed away suddenly in the spring, leaving behind no heirs, no will, and a mountain of quiet debt. Now his legacy was on the auction block, and the vultures were circling. Leading the flock of scavengers was Richard Sterling. Sterling was the Regional Acquisitions Director for Crestview Agricultural Holdings, a massive agribusiness conglomerate operating out of Chicago. He sat in the front row, his tailored navy suit, a sharp, insulting contrast to the faded denim Carhartt jackets and scuffed work boots of the locals. Sterling hadn't come to Oak Haven to farm. He had come to conquer. Crestview had already bought up 6 neighboring farms that year, leveraging the brutal 2-year drought to force families into foreclosure. The Henderson Tract was the crown jewel. It held the key to controlling the region's irrigation channels. If Crestview secured it, they could effectively choke off the water supply to the remaining independent farms, forcing a total county-wide buyout for pennies on the dollar. Sitting in the very back row, entirely ignored by the bustling room, was Jack Callahan. Jack was a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape he worked. He was 38, but looked 50, with deep lines around his eyes, and knuckles scarred from years of turning wrenches on broken-down John Deere tractors. His own 200-acre farm bordered the Henderson property to the south. Jack was currently operating under the crushing weight of a $400,000 operating loan, his corn yields having been decimated by the drought. The local gossip at the diner had already dug his financial grave. Everyone in Oak Haven knew that if Crestview took the Henderson land, Jack Callahan would be bankrupt by Christmas. But what the town didn't know, what Richard Sterling certainly didn't know, was what Jack had been doing for the past 3 weeks. When William Henderson died, Jack hadn't just mourned a neighbor, he had lost a mentor. William had always told Jack that the Henderson land held a secret, a safeguard put in place by his great-grandfather to protect the valley. Driven by desperation and a refusal to lose his family's homestead, Jack had spent weeks buried in the dusty, poorly lit basement of the county records office. He had combed through centuries-old land patents, surveying maps from the 1800s, and forgotten mineral right registries. It was on a rainy Tuesday night that Jack found the original 1892 land patent issued to the Henderson family. Due to a highly unusual and specific piece of archaic legislation, the Henderson Tract possessed absolute grandfathered and non-transferable subterranean riparian rights. It meant whoever owned the tract didn't just own the surface water. They owned total control over the massive deep water aquifer sitting beneath the entire western half of the county. More importantly, Jack discovered a fatal flaw in Crestview's aggressive expansion strategy. Crestview had been purchasing the surrounding farms with the intent of sinking high-capacity commercial wells to irrigate a massive genetically modified soybean operation. But without the Henderson Tract's specific grandfathered rights, state conservation laws would legally block Crestview from drawing a single drop of water from that aquifer. Armed with this information, Jack hadn't gone to the local bank. He knew they were already in Crestview's pocket. Instead, he made a phone call to a woman named Evelyn Davies, a ruthless high-stakes venture capitalist in Boston who had famously lost a multi-million-dollar hostile takeover bid to Crestview's CEO 3 years prior. Evelyn hated Crestview. Jack pitched her a partnership back him at the auction, secure the aquifer rights, and they could legally stall Crestview's billion-dollar Midwest development, indefinitely bleeding the conglomerate dry. Evelyn had sent her team of lawyers to verify the 1892 deed. 48 hours before the auction, she wired an astronomical sum of money into a secured escrow account with Jack Callahan as the sole authorized signatory. Now, as the clock struck noon, the heavy wooden doors of the Legion Hall were bolted shut. The murmurs in the crowd died down. Jack pulled the collar of his worn jacket up, his eyes fixed on the podium. His auction paddle, a cracked piece of plastic bearing the number 42, rested quietly on his knee. He was the poorest man in the room, sitting on the biggest secret in the state. "All right, ladies and gentlemen, settle down, boomed the voice of Dale Hennessy. Dale was the premier auctioneer in the tri-state area, a man known for his rapid-fire cadence and a penchant for theatricality. He adjusted his silver belt buckle and leaned into the microphone, his eyes immediately locking onto Richard Sterling in the front row. It was an open secret that Dale received a handsome kickback from Crestview for ensuring their acquisitions went smoothly. "We are here today to settle the estate of the late William Henderson," Dale announced, his voice echoing off the cheap wood paneling. 450 acres of prime Oakhaven soil, sold as a single tract. This is a cash auction, folks. No contingencies, no financing clauses. You bid it, you buy it, and you sign the draft today. Do we have any questions? The room was silent. A thick, suffocating tension hung in the air. "Very well. We're going to open the bidding on this beautiful piece of property at $1.5 million. Do I have 1.5? Immediately, a local syndicate of 3 older farmers raised their paddle. "I have 1.5 from the front," Dale chanted, falling into his rhythmic auctioneer cadence. "Looking for 1.6, 1.6. Do I hear 1.6? Richard Sterling didn't even look up from his phone. He casually raised 2 fingers. 1.6 to Mr. Sterling. Looking for 1.7, 1.7. The local syndicate hesitated, then raised their paddle again. 1.7. Sterling sighed, an exaggerated sound of annoyance that carried through the quiet hall. He stood up, turning to face the crowd. He wasn't just bidding, he was performing. He wanted to break the spirit of the room immediately. 3 million, Sterling said clearly, his voice cutting through Dale's chant like a scythe. A collective gasp swept through the Legion Hall. $3 million was roughly $6,600 an acre, nearly double the current market value for drought-stricken land in Oakhaven. It was a bully bid, a blatant display of corporate financial muscle designed to instantly vaporize any local competition. The three farmers in the syndicate lowered their paddle, their faces pale and defeated. They whispered furiously among themselves, but it was over. They were out. Dale Hennessy grinned a wide, predatory smile. "I have $3 million from Mr. Sterling. $3 million. Do I hear 3.1 million for the Henderson tract?" Dale let the silence drag out, letting the sheer weight of the number press down on the local farmers. He scanned the room, making a show of looking for other bids, though he knew perfectly well no one else in Oakhaven had that kind of capital. $3 million going once, Dale called out, raising his wooden gavel. In the back row, Jack Callahan took a slow, deep breath. His hands weren't shaking. He felt a strange, cold calm wash over him. $3 million going twice, Dale announced, pulling the gavel back. Jack raised his battered paddle. Number 42 shot up into the air, held steady by a calloused hand. 3.5, Jack said. His voice wasn't loud, but in the dead quiet of the room, it rang out like a rifle shot. Dale Hennessy's arm froze in midair. He blinked, peering through the harsh lighting toward the back of the room. The crowd murmured, dozens of heads whipping around to see who had spoken. When they saw Jack Callahan, the whispers turned into low, confused mutters. Richard Sterling turned around, his brow furrowed in irritation. He looked at Jack's faded clothes and dirt-caked boots, then let out a sharp, derisive scoff. Dale Hennessy lowered his gavel and leaned into the microphone. He didn't bother hiding his amusement. A loud, condescending chuckle escaped the auctioneer's lips, amplified through the speakers. "Jack," Dale said, a patronizing smirk on his face. "Jack Callahan, son, I think you wandered into the wrong building. The scrap metal auction isn't until next Thursday." A few of the corporate lawyers sitting next to Sterling laughed out loud. Some of the locals shifted uncomfortably in their seats, embarrassed for their neighbor. "This is a legally binding cash auction, Jack," Dale continued, his tone turning stern. "We aren't taking I owe us. We aren't trading for broken tractors, and we certainly aren't taking promises. If you disrupt my auction again, I'm going to have the deputies escort you off the premises. Now put the paddle down." Jack didn't lower the paddle. He held it higher. "I heard the rules, Dale," Jack replied, his voice echoing steadily across the room. "My bid is $3.5 million. Sterling stood up, his face flushing with anger. "This is a farce, Dale. Throw this bum out. He's facing foreclosure next week. He doesn't have $300 to his name, let alone $3 million. "Mr. Sterling is right, Jack," Dale said, losing his patience. "I have the legal right to demand proof of funds from any bidder I deem incapable of fulfilling the contract. Consider yourself deemed. Unless you have $3.5 million in your back pocket, you are disqualified." Jack stood up slowly. He reached into the inside pocket of his Carhartt jacket and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. He didn't say a word as he walked down the center aisle of the Legion Hall. The only sound was the heavy thud of his work boots against the linoleum floor. The crowd parted instinctively, watching him with wide eyes. Jack walked right past the glaring Richard Sterling, stepped up to the auctioneer's podium, and slapped the envelope down on the wood. "Open it," Jack said. Dale Hennessy sneered, picking up the envelope. He ripped the top off and pulled out a heavy watermarked document. It bore the embossed seal of First Boston Trust, one of the largest corporate wealth management banks on the East Coast. Dale's eyes scanned the document. At first his expression was one of irritation, but as he read the bolded legal text, the color rapidly drained from his face. His mouth parted slightly and his hands began to tremble. It was an irrevocable, certified letter of credit. It stated unequivocally that Jack Callahan was acting as the primary proxy for a private investment trust, and that the bank guaranteed cash backing for any bid placed by him up to the amount of $15 million. "Well," Sterling barked from the front row, crossing his arms. "Is it a coupon for free fertilizer? Get him out of here, Dale. We have a contract to sign." Dale swallowed hard. He looked from the document up to Jack, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer terror. He slowly reached up and adjusted the microphone. When Dale spoke, the arrogant booming auctioneer's cadence was completely gone. His voice was small, shaking, and utterly defeated. "The document is verified," Dale stammered the microphone, picking up the tremble in his breath. "The bidder is fully qualified." The auctioneer looked out at the sea of faces, avoiding Richard Sterling's furious gaze. "I have $3.5 million from bidder number 42. The laughter that had filled the room just moments before evaporated. The entire American Legion Hall went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the dusty linoleum. Jack Callahan turned around, looked directly into Richard Sterling's eyes, and gave a slow, imperceptible nod. The war for Oak Haven County had just begun. The suffocating silence in the Oak Haven American Legion Hall was shattered by the screech of a metal folding chair scraping across the linoleum floor. Richard Sterling was on his feet, his face a mottled, furious red. The polished, untouchable corporate veneer had completely evaporated, replaced by the panic of a man watching a guaranteed promotion slip through his fingers. "This is completely unacceptable," Sterling bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at Dale Hennessy. "I demand a 15-minute recess. I need to verify the authenticity of that so-called trust with my legal department in Chicago. For all we know, Callahan forged that document in his barn." Dale, still visibly shaken by the sheer amount of money guaranteed by First Boston Trust, hesitated. He looked down at Jack Callahan, who was standing quietly by the podium. Jack simply offered a slight shrug, conveying a quiet confidence that infuriated Sterling even more. "I'll grant a 10-minute recess," Dale declared, banging his gavel weakly. "But Mr. Sterling, the bank contact information is clearly listed on the letterhead. It is a legally certified document. Unless your people find definitive proof of fraud, the bid of $3.5 million stands." The room erupted into absolute chaos as Dale stepped away from the microphone. Local farmers swarmed the aisles, their voices a cacophony of disbelief, excitement, and breathless speculation. Jack ignored them all. He walked back to his seat in the rear of the hall, folded his arms, and closed his eyes. He had played Evelyn Davies's opening move perfectly. Now it was up to Crestview to decide how much they were willing to bleed. Out in the gravel parking lot, Richard Sterling was pacing furiously, his phone pressed hard against his ear. On the other end of the line was Mitchell Harrison, the ruthless chief executive officer of Crestview Agricultural Holdings, and Arthur Pendleton, the corporation's lead litigation attorney. "He's acting as a proxy, Mitchell." Sterling barked into the receiver, his breath pluming in the crisp November air. "First Boston Trust. The letter guarantees backing up to $15 million. This isn't just a local farmer trying to save a neighbor's dirt. Someone is backing him. Someone with deep pockets who knows exactly what's underneath that tract. A heavy static-filled pause hung on the line before the CEO spoke. "Evelyn Davies," Mitchell Harrison growled, his voice vibrating with venom. "It has to be her. She's been looking for a way to kneecap our Midwest expansion ever since we boxed her out of the Dakota acquisitions. She found a local straw man." "What do we do?" Sterling asked, wiping a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. "If we don't secure the Henderson tract, the 6 farms we just bought are effectively dry. We can't sink the commercial wells. We can't plant the modified soybeans. We'll be sitting on $40 million of useless drought-stricken dirt. You do not lose that auction." Richard Harrison ordered, his tone leaving absolutely no room for interpretation. "The entire region's irrigation strategy hinges on those subterranean riparian rights. Arthur, what is our absolute legal cap for this acquisition? We can liquidate up to $12 million from the Regional Expansion Fund before we have to notify the board of directors," the attorney replied over the speakerphone. "Anything above 12 and we risk triggering a shareholder inquiry." $12 million, Harrison confirmed. "Bury him, Richard. Break his spirit. I don't care if you have to bid $12 million for 400 acres. Once we drain that aquifer, the profits will cover the overrun in 3 fiscal quarters. Do not come back to Chicago without that deed." The phone clicked dead. Sterling took a deep breath, adjusted his tie, and marched back into the Legion Hall. When Dale Hennessy called the room back to order, the atmosphere was electric. The local farmers had taken their seats, leaning forward with bated breath. This was no longer just an estate auction. It was a heavyweight prize fight between Oak Haven's poorest son and Chicago's wealthiest predator. "All right, folks, the document has been verified. The trust is legitimate," Dale announced, regaining a fraction of his theatrical bravado. "The current bid is $3.5 million from bidder 42. Mr. Sterling, do you wish to counter?" Sterling didn't even sit down. He stood in the center aisle, locking eyes with Jack in the back row. $5 million, Sterling snapped. The crowd gasped. Jack calmly raised his paddle. 5.5, $7 million. Sterling shot back instantly, trying to maintain the psychological pressure. 7.5, Jack replied, his voice a flat, emotionless drawl. 10 million, Sterling yelled, his composure slipping as the numbers soared into the stratosphere of absolute absurdity. $10 million for a modest Midwestern farm was unprecedented. It was madness. 10.5, Jack countered, not missing a beat. The room was completely silent except for the back-and-forth volley of millions of dollars. Dale Hennessy simply stood at the podium, his mouth hanging open entirely, forgetting to chant. He was merely a spectator now. Sterling's hands balled into tight fists. He was nearing his limit. He glared at Jack, trying to find any sign of hesitation, any flicker of fear. But the farmer was made of stone. Jack had spent his life surviving hailstorms, crop rot, and the crushing anxiety of bank loans. A man in a tailored suit yelling numbers didn't scare him. 12 million, Sterling said, his voice dropping to a harsh final growl. $12 million! This was it, the absolute cap. If Jack backed down, now Crestview would win, but they would have paid a crippling price. Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out a small burner cell phone. He glanced at the screen. A single text message from Evelyn Davies glowed in the dim light. Finish him. Jack raised paddle number 42 for the final time. $12,100,000, Jack announced. Sterling stood frozen. The color drained completely from his face. He opened his mouth to speak, to yell, to counterbid, but the words caught in his throat. He had no authorization. He was out of ammunition. The invincible corporate giant had been outbid by a man in a dirt-stained jacket. "I have 12.1 million, Dale stuttered, his eyes darting to Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, any advance on 12.1? Sterling slowly lowered himself into his folding chair, staring blankly at the floor. "Going once," Dale called out, his voice cracking. "Going twice. Sold for $12,100,000 to Jack Callahan." The slam of the wooden gavel echoed like a gunshot. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then the Legion Hall erupted. It was a deafening roar of triumph, cheering and stomping boots. Men who had been facing foreclosure the day before were hugging each other, tears streaming down their weathered faces. The corporate beast had been slain, but as Jack signed the preliminary draft at the podium, he locked eyes with Sterling, who was storming out the back doors. Jack knew the truth. The auction was just the prologue. The real war was about to begin in the courtroom. 72 hours later, the victory in the Legion Hall felt like a distant memory. Jack Callahan found himself sitting in the heavy oak pews of the Oak Haven County Courthouse, wearing the only suit he owned, a slightly ill-fitting charcoal two-piece he had worn to William Henderson's funeral. Crestview Agricultural Holdings had unleashed their legal hounds. Mitchell Harrison had authorized an emergency multi-million-dollar litigation campaign to freeze the transfer of the property. They had filed an aggressive injunction before District Judge Harrison T. Caldwell, arguing that the 1892 land patent granting subterranean riparian rights was entirely obsolete, superseding modern state water conservation mandates. Sitting next to Jack was Rebecca Lansing, a razor-sharp environmental litigator dispatched by Evelyn Davies from Boston. Across the aisle sat Arthur Pendleton, Crestview's lead counsel, accompanied by a small army of junior associates carrying boxes of legal precedents. "Your Honor," Pendleton began, his voice dripping with condescension as he addressed the judge. "The defense is attempting to use an archaic post-Civil War land patent to hold a vital regional water supply hostage. The state's Department of Natural Resources strictly regulates the Oak Haven aquifer. This grandfathered clause is a relic, a legal fiction that cannot possibly survive modern statutory scrutiny. Crestview demands the court nullify the subterranean clause, severing it from the surface deed." Judge Caldwell, a stern man with 30 years on the bench, adjusted his reading glasses and peered over a stack of documents. "Counselor Lansing," he said, turning his gaze to Jack's lawyer. "Mr. Pendleton makes a compelling point. Century-old land patents do not automatically grant sovereign control over a shared ecological resource. What is your legal justification for blocking Crestview from accessing the aquifer from their adjoining properties?" Rebecca Lansing stood up, slowly smoothing the front of her blazer. She did not carry boxes of files. She carried a single manila folder. "Your Honor, Mr. Pendleton is absolutely correct," Rebecca said, clearly causing Jack to shoot her a panicked glance. "A standard 1892 land patent would not supersede state water laws. However, William Henderson's great-grandfather, did not receive a standard land patent. She walked forward and handed the manila folder to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. When Jack Callahan combed through the county records, he didn't just find the deed. He found the original geological survey attached to it, Rebecca explained, turning to face the Crestview lawyers. The Oak Haven Aquifer is not a stagnant underground lake. It is an active, pressurized subterranean river. And according to the United States Geological Survey of 1904, that specific river flows directly southward, surfacing entirely within the boundaries of the Clear Creek Basin. Arthur Pendleton frowned furiously, whispering to one of his associates, "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. What does a creek 20 miles away have to do with this property?" "It has everything to do with it," Rebecca countered, a predatory smile touching her lips. "Because in 1938, the federal government designated the Clear Creek Basin as a federally protected wildlife refuge under the direct jurisdiction of the Department of the Interior. It is a critical habitat for 3 endangered species of migratory waterfowl." The courtroom fell dead silent. Even Judge Caldwell sat back in his heavy leather chair, his eyes widening as he read the highlighted portions of the document. "Your Honor," Rebecca continued, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "The Henderson Tract isn't just a piece of land. It is the geographic choke point for a federally protected water source. The 1892 patent wasn't meant to grant the Hendersons water to use. It was a legal trust granting them the power to prevent anyone else from draining it. If Crestview Agricultural Holdings sinks high-capacity commercial wells on their adjoining properties, they will not be violating state code. They will be committing a federal crime by actively destroying a protected United States wildlife refuge. The Department of the Interior will not just fine them, they will seize their corporate assets." The trap had been sprung. It was a flawless, inescapable legal checkmate. Jack watched as Arthur Pendleton's jaw literally dropped. The elite Chicago lawyer grabbed the document from his associate, his eyes frantically scanning the pages, desperately searching for a loophole that did not exist. There was no countering the federal government. There was no bribing the Department of the Interior. "Is this accurate, Counselor?" Judge Caldwell asked Pendleton, his tone grave. "We need time to review this, Your Honor," Pendleton stammered, looking like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. "Injunction denied," Judge Caldwell struck his gavel with finality. "The deed transferred to Mr. Callahan is legally sound and fully executed. Furthermore, I am issuing a preemptive cease and desist order against Crestview Agricultural Holdings regarding any subterranean drilling within a 50-mile radius of the Henderson Tract, pending a full federal environmental review. Court is adjourned." The aftermath was swift and brutal. When the news of the court's decision hit the wire, Crestview's stock plummeted by 14% in a single afternoon. They had spent over $40 million acquiring 6 Oak Haven farms specifically to grow water-intensive, genetically modified crops. Without access to the aquifer, those farms were completely useless to the conglomerate. They had acquired millions of dollars of toxic debt. This was the moment Evelyn Davies descended upon Oak Haven. Acting through her venture capital firm, she didn't just walk away with the Henderson Tract. She approached a bleeding, desperate Crestview board of directors and offered to buy the 6 adjoining farms off their hands to relieve their localized debt crisis. She bought them for pennies on the dollar, A week before Christmas, Jack Callahan stood on the snow-covered porch of the Henderson farmhouse. The massive Oak Haven River bent quietly in the distance, frozen at the edges. Evelyn Davies had transferred the deeds of the 6 surrounding farms into a local agricultural cooperative trust. The independent farmers who had been foreclosed upon were leased their land back on highly favorable permanent terms, effectively saving the entire community from corporate extinction. Jack remained the steward of the Henderson tract, farming it the way William had taught him, ensuring the deep water below remained untouched, guarding the valley, just as the 1892 patent intended. The quietest farmer in the county hadn't just raised a paddle. He had raised an army, and in doing so, he had saved the soul of Oak Haven. The gavel may have fallen, but the echoes of Jack's bravery will resonate in Oak Haven forever. When everyday people stand up against corporate greed with intelligence and courage, the impossible becomes reality. If you were inspired by Jack's incredible fight to save his town's legacy, hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs a victory today, and subscribe for more unbelievable true-to-life dramas.